So again, thank you, USC, for having me. The title of my talk today is called Rogue States and Unruly Archives. And I tried to create a kind of open yet sexy and exciting title. My work recycles, copies, resuscitates, warps, reframes, makes do, rips off, plunders, and hinges on existing forms and historical archives because the past is still unfinished business. And some of the creative tactics that I've tried to list off or just kind of make a note to myself include obfuscating, layering or piling, fragmenting or damaging, crumpling, folding, selective cropping, editing, framing, pixelating, downsampling, blurring, removing, healing, inverting, reversing, presenting in as-is condition, rephotographing, republishing, reprinting, revealing, releasing, and re-archiving. So I like to start off also with just a brief kind of visual overview of what my work was like for the past, the first about 15 years of my practice. And I come from a sculpture background, so most of the projects were large-scale installations in which I was collaborating with institutions and organizations to produce works that sometimes had hundreds or even thousands of objects or components that were sometimes made in collaboration with others, but had a kind of relational section or segment to it. If I were to also kind of map out my interests, sculpture is definitely in that center, and that's really where I got my undergraduate degree in. But from there, thanks to the beauty of being a contemporary artist, I can also branch out to lots of other mediums, not just photography. So although I'm here as the photography lecturer, my projects also go into everything from social practice to new media, textiles, craft, print and publication, installation, video, etc. But somehow it always comes back to objecthood. So even if it's an image, there's something for me that's very physical in the way it's thought about and manifests. I also like to start with a kind of personal image that helps sort of frame maybe an early connection. I immigrated to the United States when I was 3 years old. This is a photograph of myself at 4 years old, here posed with my mother, who is 18 years older than me. And for my birthday in 1979, she took me to a photo studio in Disneyland. And so we posed in this kind of a 19th century outfit as if we were new Americans. And thinking about this notion too of like an immigrant entryway into the country and what it means to essentially attempt to become an American through the sort of staging and lens of this form of Disneyland. I also like to think about how photography is, in essence, an incredibly staged discipline. So in this image, which is a stock photo of all the lighting, the backdrops, the kind of tools and equipment that creates an image, I like this image because it's literally the things that made the image take center stage. And these are the implements that I kind of became really fascinated with. And especially the chroma key green backdrop, which most people are familiar with in the sense that anything you photograph or shoot in front of it, you can substitute that bright green for an image in its wake. And so it's technically supposed to be invisible. It's a stand-in for something that's not supposed to be there. And similarly, for those of you that are familiar with digital imaging, what I refer to as the Photoshop transparency layer, which is that very back layer. If you cut out everything in a Photoshop image, you're left with this really interesting and kind of crazy gray and white checkerboard pattern. Again, something that's supposed to be invisible but is highly visible and highly present. You're not supposed to take it into account. And so thinking about also the standards and conventions of photography, in the 1990s, I worked as a graphic designer for the Exploratorium Museum in San Francisco, and we were given in the early days of Adobe Photoshop this color calibration chart in which we were supposed to compare it to the images we saw on our screen in order to get a correct image. And I'm fascinated with the conventions of photo calibration charts because there's invariably something odd about them. There's a standardization in the images that are used as examples. And in this case, we have this, the image was officially called Olé no Moiré. It was an early chart that Adobe made, and on the woman's headdress, you can kind of see it spells out Adobe. And then it's also this kind of parody of this ethnicized individual, available to kind of compare and contrast as a correct image. And calibration charts in general are really odd things. There's lots of different variations of them. Individual photo studios will make their own, and they'll put forward the conventions that they believe other images should be compared to. So if we look at this still life, or say like, a very normative image of a marriage, this is the kind of symbol of what a standard is. And then it starts to get really weird. Sometimes people are just kind of slapping random colorful images together, and especially when it comes to skin tones. Like, that's a very interesting thing to see of the variety of skin tones, also the idea of a kind of feminized beauty, and then odd kind of still life constructions of random objects. And this is one of my favorite. This is like a hyper what do you call it, a hyper-ethnicized musical display where everyone is like really amplified their, I guess, identities. It's a very staged kind of image. And then, this I think is the German version, which was a little later. They're more subdued. They're kind of a little bit more serious. But they're also arranged in this, very kind of hyper polarized space where, the three women, similar to the image before, kind of represent this hyper specialized representation. So, one of the first large-scale installations I did in which I was incorporating both photo calibration charts, the green screen, different patterning, and other kinds of references was an installation called Dodge and Burn in 2019. And so this is a giant wooden platform, which is almost like a stage. It's about 20 feet wide and 15 feet high. And on top of it are a mix of objects and image objects, as well as fabricated garments in custom patterns. And there's a lot of different things at play here, and I'm not going to really talk too much about what the whole thing means because it's actually meant to be dissonant and confusing. So in thinking about the color calibration charts, about how there was a kind of mess of objects kind of thrust together, I'm loosely playing off of images that I've downloaded from the internet of museum collection sites, of stock photo sites, of historical references. And the entire thing is a kind of, for me, a collapse of thinking through the colonial effects of American empire, specifically in the Philippines, but also in almost any other space that had the empire overlaid on top of them. So, when going through the different images and the kind of overlaps of things, I was looking also at everything from color cosmetic skin charts, like different foundations that could be applied to, to match or not match different skin tones. The other calibration charts I was finding, herbaria samples of like dried and pressed plants from colonial era accumulations. And then also everything from stock photos of tropical fruit. Like you can see the logos attached to the iStock photo, and I think there's like Getty in there. And there's emojis that populate and litter the platform. And there's also chroma key green painted objects. So the caps kind of remind me of mega hats. And there's also chroma key green painted tiki torches. And the tiki torch, some of these things also reference the aftermath of the 2017 protests against the first regime. We're in the second one now. But the first one, there were a lot of visible protests, and I attended many of them, actually. So this collapse of kind of like both historic images of contemporary culture, and the invisibility and visibility of white supremacy as symbolized through the chroma key green. the thing that you are not supposed to see or that you see everywhere is kind of permeating the installation. There's also everything from very specific Filipino objects, insider references of different weapons that I downloaded from the Philippine collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then printed on adhesive vinyl at exactly the right size of the object, and then adhered that vinyl print to a laser cut wood cutout. So a lot of these images that you see that look like sculptures are actually front flat props. And then as you go around, you start to realize the staged quality of it. And then in the back, there's also this kind of pale gray, washed out American flag. And I hand sewed a lot of the textile components. There's a floating head also in there that references a kind of like folklore of the manananggal, which is a kind of like a female vampire that sucks the blood out of unsuspecting sleepers at night. A lot of these things also, they don't make sense together. And that's really how I was thinking about, if we are to try to make sense of where we are today, or even back in 2017, the effects of both white supremacy and colonialism have mutated and have also kind of turned into both historical and contemporary visions. There's also a mix of like images of Filipino revolutionaries that fought against American oppression after the Philippines became a US colony. And as you walk around the back of the installation, you start to realize, though, that there's also the implication of an uprising or a kind of a disintegration of the type of order happening. So chroma key green bricks and rocks and sticks and methods of kind of countering the frontality of the stage. And then the emojis also come up from the side. And so it's the fists and the poop emojis. The poop emojis are pooping on the white supremacist objects. That's kind of like, kids love that. Like they always gravitate towards that. So there's this mix of like a kind of seriousness and then also a kind of play at some of the markers that are happening here. And so, in thinking about that kind of like, that collapse of images and objects and things that are, accumulated together, I really think about the museum model because, if you think about a Wunderkammer, which is a collection of objects that are made to either speak to each other, maybe there's some order, maybe there's not. The conventions we have of museums, either through salon style or the collections of things to put together a loose narrative, is something that's we're continually seeing. This is the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art in Hartford, Connecticut, and I was commissioned to do a project in response to. Well, I decided I was going to do it in response to the collection. I was just commissioned to do a project, and then I was like, "This is the oldest East Coast museum in the country, and they hold the most iconic collection of Hudson River School paintings. This is one of their, the main halls that as you enter into it, you're kind of confronted with this grandiose narrative of some kind. And as I do these kinds of projects with curators, usually we have about a couple days where I'm trying to assess and figure out what exactly it is I want to do. So I'm going to share, a couple loose ideas at the time before I landed on one. At one point I said, I want to look at all your broken objects. I want to see all the things that you're too embarrassed to show in the galleries because it doesn't show the right story of how either well cared for they are or maybe there was something, not quite right about it. So this is just some shots of in the storeroom of like very dusty, imperfect or undisplayable objects. I also wanted to look at the objects that were broken and that were being kind of mended or cared for in the conservation labs. And there's a really interesting aesthetic, too, to the kind of ruin or, the object that needs to be cared for or handled, because for me, there's a metaphor there in terms of thinking about how history itself is kind of both constructed but also stewarded. We have to, in order to kind of avoid for things to crumble or not hold their original space or meaning, we have to continually keep repairing it or adding to the original object. So in this case, I think this is a decorative object, and some of the little bits had broken off, and the little blue pieces that you see are molds for new surrogate plaster pieces that would be cast and then added to it, almost like a little appendage. And there were also some really serendipitous things, like in the conservation lab, this is a bust by Hiram Powers, literally titled America, and it needed fixing. It was broken, and they needed to kind of repair it. And so, in terms of like that serendipitous moment of seeing it here in a lab, taken out of its kind of presentational quality and looking like it needed care, it felt very appropriate, because I think today especially, and actually for a very long time, we've been kind of like trying to figure out, what is wrong with America. The other things I looked at too were part of the Wadsworth's object mounts collection. So it turns out the Wadsworth Museum was founded on the legacy of the Colt family, which was responsible for the creation of Colt firearms, one of the largest arms manufacturers that helped, quote unquote, tame the West, and was responsible for, the kind of implementation of Manifest Destiny. So the firearms themselves are considered decorative arts. They're works of art, which I think is really interesting. And that's just the way that, the artisanry of the metal smithing and the kind of decoration on top of them, that's how they were categorized. And then they also had this amazing, amazing collection of copy negatives. So prior to digital technology, if another entity wanted a picture of an artwork held at the Wadsworth, they would have to make a request and then receive a physical copy negative or positive. And then that was used to reproduce the image in a catalog or any kind of like reproduction. And so interestingly, the Wadsworth held on to these copy negatives, even though they're not circulated anymore. Like everything is now digital. But I became fascinated with the reproductions of the artworks themselves. Because when I think about how those artworks themselves were trafficked, in the sense that they were constantly being reproduced, and that some of the visions in them of, say, landscape, or even the kind of empty space of the American terrain was ready for takeover, paintings like this by Albert Bierstadt were, in essence, fantasies. They were composites of a kind of ideal of what the American landscape should look like as a sort of open receptacle for settlement. So, the idyllic quality of these were really fascinating. What was also interesting, and of course I think the photo students would be interested in this, is that the analog technology of like the film, the positive or the negative of it, wasn't necessarily meant to last. And so what we're looking at here is the actual colors of the negative or the positive itself starting to shift. And so this light purple shifting, this kind of imperfect space, I wound up, for my own project, I simply rephotographed on a light table the old inaccurate reproductions along with their accompanying labels. So you see it here in its clear plastic sleeve along with the annotations of the Wadsworth's ownership of the work. And then this is, Color Shift, Asher Durand, View Toward the Hudson Valley, 1851. And the titles have all the acquisition, the numbers attached to it too. And then I blew them up really large and framed them. So in a sense, as a photographer, I'm photographing other photographers' work of images, and just making sure too that I capture the sort of all the segments of the institutional framework around it. So in this case, you can see the little the Kodak color bars at the top, and also the edges of the film on the sides. And so in trying to figure out the installation format for this, I wound up creating a large installation, a visual installation in the room in which I was compiling and overlaying some of these iconic paintings in the collection. So imagine this is on the ground floor of the Wadsworth, and on the second floor you see the actual paintings. And so it's a kind of introduction into the notion of the whole staged quality of the museum and how artworks themselves are kind of held in a pedagogical way in terms of thinking about history. And here it's been sort of like maybe deconstructed or taken into a different space. Apart from the vinyl wall murals, the photographs were framed and placed on top of it. There were also green screen or green chroma key paint and other segments added to it. In particular, this painting, or the original painting, which we're actually not seeing, we're looking at the copy negatives of. It's a painting called The Murder of Jane McCrae by John Vanderlyn from 1804, and it is the most popular painting in the collection of the Wadsworth. It's also the most sensational in the sense that it didn't depict an actual event that happened, but it was the most popular in the sense that it depicted the savagery of natives. And so the amount of times the registration records said that they sold this image to different books or different catalogs, many of which had nothing at all to do with the actual topic, but was used as an illustration, was really fascinating. And so the title of my show is called Image Trafficking, because in the end, the museum was complicit and pushed forward these notions based on their collection. And whenever I re-show these images, I make it a point also to not just automatically re-show it, but there's a kind of visual intervention in some way. So, whether it's like finding the image of the label that obscures it or the negative of the image so you're not actually looking at that painting. And the other, not only just working with museum collections, but also working with different historical society or museum archives, I think of my practice as having a tendency to talk back to the archives, because in many cases what's in them is also a kind of perspective that's been either curated or with many blind spots. So in particular, I'm actually not going to go through a lot of, I'm going to focus on the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship that I did in DC. And I specifically asked to work with the National Museum of American History because I was interested in seeing what their holdings were on the Philippines. I wasn't interested in the Anthropology Museum. I wanted to know what the National Museum of American History saw of its colony. Not in any kind of real way or a kind of documentary way, but more of like, what does the Philippines or what do we look like within the American archive? And so when I shoot in an archive, this is essentially what it looks like. There's a lot of documents and papers that are called forward, and it's a very lengthy process. It takes days or weeks of just sifting and looking, because in many cases it can be difficult to find what I'm looking for. But overall, the collection, it's also digitized in some way. So if I were to type in the word Philippines, there's definitely a number of things that come up. Here it says, 67,350 images in the collection, which sounds like a lot. But then the more you go into it, the more you realize a lot of them are natural materials that have been collected. So botanical specimens, things in which as a expedition or a military incursion went out into the land, others were brought forward to collect, to bring back the kind of remnants and study objects from the place. So in the end, not a lot, I would say, was there except for there were way more biological samples than there were photos. And then if you search for Filipino-American, at the time, you got nothing. So, that's obviously not true. It's a keyword situation. It's just that at a certain point, search terms aren't exactly the most accurate, or nobody has thought to search for it. The other thing interesting in these archives is that you encounter a lot of low-resolution proxies of the image. And in this case, I thought this was interesting because it's a crappy JPEG of a bad microfilm copy of a crumbling glass plate negative, I think. So you've got these multiple levels of like an image degradation, and in the end, this is what you're left with as a reference. So when I harvest images, I kind of rampantly collect. I download, I rephotograph, and then I just kind of like sit with them for a while, and I try to consider what type of narrative emerges visually. And as I'm collecting, I'm also amassing this kind of like database, honestly. I'm amassing my own database of the database and the collections of the institution. These are Xeroxes of documents, and so I'm shooting them here for later reference. And then in the end, the question's always like, well, what do you do with it? Like, how do you turn it into art? How do you turn it into anything that's not just a timeline of events, but something that processes it more? So in this case, it was a gallery exhibition at Ryan Lee in New York. It's a giant platform with paper prints overlaid on top of it. And it kind of reminds me a little bit similarly of the overlapping and the overlaying. It's almost like there's too many windows open on your computer screen, where all of a sudden things start to kind of create juxtapositions or narratives with each other that might not have meant to have been. And I think it's a similar approach actually to the dodge and burn work, where too many things were happening. And so we're kind of attempting to kind of create a narrative out of these disparate messages. And this is also my way of also blowing open the archive a little bit, because it's not like it doesn't make sense, but it's meant to be sort of browsed in a more kind of poetic way. And I can definitely tell what everything is. Like I can track back every image, but I don't feel like it's necessarily important for the viewer to always know. And so alongside with this, kind of tabletop platform display were a series of framed images that weren't necessarily about the Philippines, but were about the archive itself being a hazy place, being a place in which it's very difficult to see. So in this case, it's a scratched magic lantern slide that's so damaged that the image itself is gone, but then this other sort of like almost glistening color field emerges. When I shoot it, and this is interesting too, you can kind of tell, so I take the image I shot and I print it on a crappy color LaserJet printer on 8.5 by 11 paper, and I tape it together with Scotch tape, and then I pin it to the wall of my studio, and then I take a high-res camera and I photograph that, and then I print that. So there's, again, this sort of like, transition, and the edges of the crappy paper look like this in the print. Like, it looks almost like a trompe-l'oeil, but it's the print. And then the question always is like, well, what do you do with really problematic images? So along with searching for, say, the Philippines, I also encounter lots of other things in the American archive. And I'm trying to tie it in too, because I don't think we can isolate what happened, say, in the Philippines or through a colonial lens as just having happened overseas, but it's part of a kind of continuum of activity and also American history. So in the case of looking at files from the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, this is from the Ohio chapter that's in the records of the Smithsonian. And so what I did was I went through all the paperwork in the file folder and turned them over after I looked at them. And then I photographed the stack of papers from the reverse, from behind. So it essentially muffled or turned away the images and the messages and the kind of propaganda that was on those materials. And then in the end, what you have is a kind of almost like abstracted, neutralized form. So there's and you can see the tape also, which is the photo of the tape. And this is a piece called Professional Rejects. It's a box from the studio of H.C. Anderson from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I really appreciated this because it's an object relic of a photographer's practice. And I really appreciate that he had written on here the word rejects, and that as if it was this kind of like, I don't know, like a way to sort of also talk back to the standard of this image on the box. And the image itself, when I downloaded it from the Smithsonian site, was pixelated. And so when I blew it up, it obviously had that quality as well. And so I kind of lean into this, the resolution of something, because I also believe that high res is a luxury that not all of us can afford. This is a piece called Fragment Military Officer from Alexander Schadenberg Photographs of the Philippines. It's a Spanish officer in the Philippines, and the beauty of this is that this image itself has started to deteriorate. So as a glass negative, all the fragmented pieces that you see off of it was found this way. And so I, again, reprinted it as crappy color laserjet prints, taped them together, pinned it to the wall, and then photographed in high res, and then printed it at the size it would be in real life. The one, I think, really positive image that I really appreciated was I found this, the most joyful image I could find of Filipinos was taken, this is 11 Filipino women in native dress from the American Counterpoint Project by Alexander Aland, who was a Jewish-Ukrainian refugee who came over in the I think late 30s, in the 30s, and spent his life photographing immigrant and refugee groups in New York. So he had a very socialist background. And his work is really underrated. He had taken a beautiful set of photographs of Filipinos here in the 1940s, and they're dancing. They're joyous, and they're dancing, and they're socializing. And honestly, given the nature of the colonial archive, this was one of the most, I would say, like, positive images I found. So I decided to spotlight it in a similar manner to give it its kind of place up front. So, you know, as I do this work also, invariably the colonial archive is something that, you know, you can't avoid. And so I'm actually not going to go into a lot of the images of it, but as I'm photographing, I shoot the folders. I also just absorb the reflections in the space against the archival sleeves. And then I create what I call a rogue finding aid, which is folders of all my visual research that others can also research from. Because in many cases, these images are not digitized. There's no desire or funds to digitize them. And so for anyone to get access to them, you have to physically get your body there and commit to it. And that economic commitment is not something everybody can have access to. And so I kind of see myself as this like avatar re-archivist, and as I harvest these images, they become part of hopefully another kind of public record that other people can access. It's like sifting and browsing, you know, without having to be there. And so I become the kind of hands for other people. But the one of the projects I did do with some of this research, this is Blind Spot, 40 archival pigment prints of digitally healed ethnographic images, and those are framed on a large-scale vinyl backdrop wall. The video is a totally different project, but it was in the same space. And what I've been doing with ethnographic photos is what I call healing them, which is a kind of weird term because you can't go back in history and change anything. But what do we do with the images as they keep circulating, and especially those that were taken under duress or under conditions in which the person being photographed wasn't exactly in on the project? So I've been using in Photoshop the healing brush tool, which some of you might know of. It's this great tool that's usually used to get rid of blemishes on people's faces. And if you gently rub it across someone's body, it actually attempts to kind of take the digital image surrounding it and kind of fill it in this really soft and hazy way. And so I'm not erasing the person, I'm releasing them from having to always be held in this image and under the caption under which they were placed in. It's an imperfect healing in the sense that everything always kind of looks wrong. It's like a spirit or a phantom sort of mark that's left over. It's highly self-conscious. It's not meant to be seen as a perfect rendition because I actually don't think we should perfectly heal. Like, I think we shouldn't cover up some of those things, but I do want to grant some dignity to people so that they don't always have to be locked into that narrative. And I think they're also kind of interesting. You know, there's something formally fascinating about them. And you're searching, you're like looking. So if you have to look at 40 of these or more, you're trying to figure out, or you're imagining maybe who they are, or what they are, or not. So, I also have to say the Colonial Archive is a total bummer. It's really a bummer. And so in order to give myself an antidote, because I spent years going through it, and I'm not showing a lot of that work actually. My website holds a lot of it. But recently, last year, I did an installation using archives from an actual Filipino-American archive here in the United States. And so I worked with the collection of the Filipino-American National Historical Society in Seattle. And these are images of the people, by the people, and the focus was so different. And so for this project at the Frye Art Museum called Tender Sifter Keeper Center, it's a giant physical paper pinboard with large oversized prints and a kind of collage representation of some of the families, the visuals, the kind of more intimate spaces in which people are attempting to create, you know, some semblance of their own lives within the United States. And for me, it's a joyful piece. It's a great project, and embedded in the installation are 3 video monitors in which I'm physically opening up folders in real time and holding up to the camera each image I find in there. So it's a very slow process, and it's also one of kind of discovery, because I don't look at the images before I open the folder. So I'm discovering it at the same time that the camera is recording my discovery of it. And then there's also different scaled images. The large image of the hand is actually of the archivist who's now 94 years old, Dorothy Cordova, who's single-handedly runs the archive. And this is a video still of sifting through the objects for the camera. And so I have one more project to show. Well, actually 2. But one of them, the main one, and I'm really excited to share it actually, because this is the first time I'm sharing and talking about it in the United States. Inherent vice is a term that's used to describe, it's a conservation term, and it refers to the tendency in physical objects to deteriorate because of the fundamental instability of the components of which they are made, as opposed to deterioration caused by external forces. In other words, there's something about the paper, the material, the thing itself, that it either has an acid in it that eventually starts to yellow or eat away at it. It's self-destructing as it lives, and it will constantly self-destruct unless it's stabilized. And so I'm using that as a metaphor in thinking about political structures, and specifically governments that slide into authoritarianism. So the Philippines government was modeled after the United States' government. As it was a US colony, the United States established both an educational system as well as its basic governmental structure. So a lot of the Philippines' ideals was a kind of like parallel to the US. In the 1970s, specifically 1972, it slid into martial law and dictatorship. It was a democracy that essentially voted for its authoritarian government. Fascinating, huh? So in 2020, when was it? In 2023, I was invited to do research at the Lopez Museum and Library in the Philippines. And originally, I thought I was going to look at the Spanish colonial era photos and documents, because I'd never really worked with that before, and they had a really wonderful holding of that. And then I discovered that they had the entire photojournalism collection of photos of the Manila Chronicle, which was one of the longest running newspapers in the Philippines, which was also shut down in 1972 at the start of martial law. So the free press was no more after 1972 until the Marcos regime was ousted 14 years later. But thankfully, the Lopez Museum and Library holds all of its physical prints. And so this is a shot of part of the archive of it. The collection of photojournalist images taken for newspapers is traditionally called a photo morgue, which is a great term. It's so interesting. It's like where images go to die. It's also a very manual filing system. Obviously, this was before databases or digital systems, and so each photo had to be put in a specific kind of like index of it. And so the indexing system itself is really interesting because it reflects the kind of terms or ideas that would have been prevalent in attempting to find a particular image. And so what was also fascinating is that you start to, if you go through this catalog, if you go through the years, and as it starts to creep towards 1972, you start to see this big uptick and rise in the visuals of protest and resistance. And many of these images were never published, which is really fascinating, because obviously photographers and photojournalists were taking more images than could have been printed. They still filed them away in there. And so they almost act as a kind of evidence of a time that has never been viewed. When an image was printed, you would see on the back of it the caption of what was harvested from the newspaper that it was illustrated with, and then the stamps and marks on how what size it was to be produced at, or even what date of newspaper. So there is some markings. And as I was going through them, I was really struck that at the same exact time as all the sort of agitation or protest or resistance to the impending dictatorship, there was, as normal for a newspaper, there were images of lifestyle and fashion and contemporary culture running in parallel. And so in looking at, as I'm rephotographing them, I'm also very quickly creating these impromptu collages in which I'm layering or attempting to kind of conceal or reveal different narratives. And in this particular case, I'm showing side by side two sets of images, one in which an explosion has happened and there's a kind of forensics of a bombing. And then on the right-hand side, a beauty pageant in which it's being protected by a mounted, a policeman on a motorcycle. And I'm really thinking about a kind of impending regimentation and policing of life. There's also, this piece is called Hand Studies, and they're headshots of Ferdinand Marcos, the president/dictator at the time. And the interesting, kind of red marks are the cropping marks in which the photo editor is saying, okay, take this part of the image, blow it up to here, and those are all left as part of the photo. And the interesting thing about authoritarianism, and the slide towards it, is that it's also filled with a lot of banality. Not everything looks really exciting. It's actually disguised in many ways, and there's lots of things to distract people. In this case, I was also looking at lifestyle images of interior decor at the same time. This is interior world pensive girl, second wave go-go dancers. I mean, they're beautiful too. It's a really interesting time capsule of the Philippines at this moment in which there's a kind of cosmopolitan outward face. Then I kind of slide in a couple things where I'm kind of overlaying my own meaning. This is side eye, Western view. A white woman holding a nice brunette wig. Girl group 2, ornamented blondes. It starts to get a little interestingly ornamented or even ridiculous. Hair, eyes, tears. Creating these loose kinds of components. Plant stack. Preventive measures, student revolt. Night fever, cool group. Crowd control, cold stare. Reference shots, Aquino array. So the assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr. was a pivotal moment and a further slide towards the kind of dictatorship of the Marcos regime. And so these headshots exist. It's obviously before he was assassinated, or before he was imprisoned and then exiled and then assassinated. But they're all kind of frozen in the archive. And as well as pictures that I'm also bringing forward as a kind of not a direct illustration, but as a kind of poetic reference. So this is a NASA image of an exploding galaxy, contemporary design, modern adolescence, a file labeled photography, and inside also a demonstration from Kent State in the United States. So there's this kind of similar mashup of the Philippines, the United States, a kind of global look. And then convergent student leaders. So these were some of the young student protesters who were leading some of the resistance. And I think a lot too about who the photojournalists were, because many of them were not identified. They didn't sign their images. And this notion too that some of these people are still alive, or some of them might have been tortured or disappeared or taken, or even identified or related to others today. And so when I'm thinking about re-showing these images, it's a delicate balance between pushing forward these images that haven't been seen before, and also to do so in a country in which there's still a hangover of the dictatorship, because the son of Marcos is now currently the president, and there's an erasing of the history. And I feel like there's so many parallels. Like when I was first doing this work, I was really thinking about all the ways in which the United States' system and slide was just starting to happen as well. One of the funny asides is these basket anti-riot shields. So the policemen had these like great crafted shields. I call it authoritarian craft. And in this case, it's titled Rattan Offense, because I think it's kind of offensive to the craft. So, this mix of images, and I'll skip forward a little bit. How do you show them in a country in which it's still actually not popular to show? Like it's very difficult to talk about this because it's not like it ever went away. So I hide a lot. Like this is actually a show at Silver Lens in Manila, and we marketed the show as being about the times. So the times were crazy. The times had like fashion and cool stuff happening, and then there was strife. But it's really a way to show, to present to the public a new way of looking at some of the significant details of the slide towards authoritarianism, but through images that aren't common, because a lot of the ways that these images are images of Marcos are heavily trafficked as kind of standalone images. But if you start embedding or suggesting things, it gets a little more complicated. And so it was really interesting to see what people who lived through the time had to say about it. And I got a lot of young people talking to me and asking me and basically saying, we never see photos like this. They don't teach us this in high school. Can you tell me more about this? And it was just so interesting that, through this like art context, we could have that conversation. And this is a large mural. I call it a camouflage study because embedded within what look like innocuous lifestyle images are images of resistance and protest and uprising, but it's kind of difficult to see. And then we also printed and sent out for takeaway from the gallery. This is called Phantom Edition Halftone Study. And it's an incredibly illegible, overly halftoned image of the front page of the last newspaper of the Manila Chronicle that never got distributed. They had printed them, but it was never sent out because of martial law's crackdown on the free press. So there were piles of this newspaper of the news that never actually saw the light of day. And so we turned it into a kind of way to distribute it 50 years later, but through the hazy means of illegibility. And then as part of the show too, in one of the back rooms, I took way more photos than I could print or make sense of in terms of showing. And so there was a massive slideshow that ran, and it had almost 1,000 images that took an hour to cycle through. And if you stayed, you would see the kind of arc and flow. But most people would come in and just see a couple images and not quite understand. And so in the end, the exhibition itself was not problematic because it was so hard to find some of the normally offensive or problematic things. And that's been an interesting way to work too, is like, how do you work within the margins of what can be said or can't be said? And I think we're all kind of grappling with that right now in different ways. There was also, we put out a display table of conservation tools, and I worked with the conservation team at the museum to just have this like kind of pedagogical overlay. And so I have two short things that I'll end with. So as I'm going through and doing this research, I have an outward, or not secret, I have another ongoing project called Reader Copies, and I rephotograph and reprint out of print or rare books on Philippine art, politics, and culture and US colonialism. And I use DIY print-on-demand titles. So many of these books are very expensive. If you were to buy one or find one, sometimes they're up to $300. And I think it's crazy that we're actually not able to access certain parts of our history or heritage, or even documents on martial law. And so if you go to bit.ly Reader Copies, you can print and you can order at incredibly affordable prices your own copy of some of these out-of-print titles. And it's an ongoing project, and I do this as I encounter things that I think could fit into it. And then lastly, I'll finish up with a project I just finished 2 weeks ago at the Hawaii Triennial in Honolulu. And this is an installation called Blind Spot Artifacts. It's at the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum. So in Honolulu, it's the oldest, it's the national museum, the National Historical and Anthropology Museum in Hawaii. It features repurposed museum display casements, plinths, and empty object mounts, as well as mounted healed digital photographs. So as you're walking through, the healed photographs are kind of, I would say, they almost look like footnotes. They sort of dot the installation, which is full of pedestals, as well as the mounts that held precious historical or cultural objects. Only, they've been released. Like, we don't see the objects, and what we're left with is the kind of skeletal structures of the mounts themselves, which honestly lend themselves to a kind of beauty. Like, I don't see this actually as necessarily a critique on the museum, but a proposition about, like, what happens if we exit, if we vacate the structures in which we felt that there was a kind of hold on us, or even a hold on the imagination. What can we build on what's left over? And I would say that there's beauty in it too, because when I see these metal objects, I think about everything from like, modernist art to, skeletal noguchis. There's something very formal about them. And so I don't see it as a negative, I see it as a potential, this idea of a post-colonial aesthetic, or a post-colonial modernism that could be possible if we were more imaginative than the things that we were given. And so I'm going to end on this image, which is a shot of the pile of just some of the empty museum mounts that I was able to sift through. And it's with the graciousness of the Bishop Museum. So doing this kind of work also means having to really talk through and think through the impacts on how an institution wants to work with me on this. And I just really, really value the ones that trust me and work together to create it. It's not a critique on the Bishop Museum. It's actually a way to imagine with them. So thank you very much.